On April 10, 1973, James Ikens, head of the Office of Fuels and Energy at the State Department, delivered a speech in Denver at a meeting of the American Petroleum Institute, an organization representing the American oil industry. In his speech, he stated that the world was facing a significant increase in oil prices. Since the end of World War II, oil prices had barely changed, fluctuating mostly between $2 and $3 per barrel. This was not the first time Ikens had made such claims. He had already warned Kissinger and President Richard Nixon in a secret report, stating that the global oil industry was experiencing the last throes of a market where buyers determined prices. In that report, he predicted that by 1975, or possibly even earlier, the world would enter a permanent state of a seller-dominated market, where a major producer could create a crisis by halting oil supplies. According to his recommendations, the United States should undertake expensive and unpopular measures to conserve energy, intensify the search for domestic resources, and import oil only from secure sources. However, his recommendations were not well received. Nixon's chief domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, told Ikens that energy conservation was not part of the Republican Party's ethos. Ikens, however, remained convinced that few understood what was coming. In April of that year, he reiterated his warnings in an article for the influential journal Foreign Affairs. The title of the article was telling, "The oil crisis roars and the clock is ticking." Although the article was widely read, few believed Ikens was right. In June 1973, Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, visited the United States. At the time, the policy of détente, a relaxation of tensions between the two nuclear superpowers, was in effect. A year earlier, on May 22nd, President Nixon had visited Moscow, and on May 26th, the U.S. and the Soviet Union signed the SALT-I Agreement, the first treaty limiting strategic nuclear weapons. In June 1973, Brezhnev made a return visit. The American president even hosted him in his private residence. After the two leaders had retired for the final night of the summit, something unexpected happened. An anxious and sleepless Brezhnev suddenly requested an unscheduled meeting with Nixon. Despite the apparent breach of diplomatic protocol, the Secret Service woke the president, who, though skeptical, received the Soviet leader in his small office overlooking the dark, silent ocean. For the next 3 hours, in front of a small fire, Brezhnev spoke in a rough yet emotional manner about how the Middle East was a powder keg and that war would soon break out there. He insisted that the only way to prevent it was through a new diplomatic initiative. In broad terms, without specifics, he said the Soviets knew something about the intentions of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Syrian President Hafez al-Assad. After all, the Soviet Union had been supplying them with weapons. He warned that the consequences of war could threaten the further development of Soviet-American détente. Present at the meeting, alongside Nixon, were Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and National Security Advisor. Both believed that this unusual warning was not necessarily a sincere concern from the Soviets, but rather an attempt to initiate a diplomatic effort in the Middle East that would benefit the Soviet Union and its Arab allies, Egypt and Syria. This was the second serious warning that something significant was approaching. Recall that in June 1967, Israel had defeated the armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in the Six-Day War, occupying the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. In November of that year, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 242, calling on Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories, while Arab states were to recognize Israel's right to exist. However, in September 1967, the Arab League held a summit in Khartoum, which ended with the adoption of the famous Three No's resolution. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. After the Six-Day War, a war of attrition began between Egypt and Israel, mainly fought along the front lines separating Israeli and Egyptian forces. There was no peace along the front with Syrian forces either, nor between the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, and Israel. In 1970, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser died and was succeeded by Anwar al-Sadat. The new Egyptian president aimed to break the status quo established by the Six-Day War. Daniel Yergin writes that Sadat sought the support and cooperation of Saudi Arabia, and he got it. Faisal allegedly went so far as to promise $1 billion for Sadat's war fund. Moreover, the king pledged that he would not hesitate to use oil as a weapon. But give us time, he's reported to have added. We do not want to use our oil as a weapon in a battle that will last 2 or 3 days and then end. We want to see a battle that will last long enough to mobilize world opinion. The House of Saud did not recognize the existence of the Zionist entity, as they called the State of Israel. However, its kings, starting with the founder of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, had never used oil as a weapon to aid Arab states in wars against Israel. Saudi Arabia was an important ally of the United States. Cheap oil was the foundation of the post-war development of both the U.S. and its allies. In the autumn of 1973, all of this would change. In September 1960, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela founded OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. These nations believed that powerful oil companies, mostly American and British, the strongest of them known as the Seven Sisters, were exploiting them. OPEC members sought greater control over oil prices, as well as control over its production and export. Even without Faisal's promise, they had already intended to extract higher oil prices from the Seven Sisters. In September 1973, representatives of OPEC member states met in Vienna, led by Saudi Arabia's oil minister. The war that Sadat had hinted at to King Faisal was approaching, but in secrecy. On October 5th, the CIA briefed President Nixon, stating that the movement of Egyptian and Syrian forces did not indicate that they were planning an attack on Israel. Daniel Yergin writes, that same day, while it was still afternoon in Washington, night had fallen in the Middle East. And in Israel, as the somber and sacred Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur began, everything gradually came to a halt. In Riyadh, Saudi OPEC delegates boarded a jet to Vienna. They spent the flight focused on technical files, prices, inflation, corporate profits. Only when the delegation arrived in Vienna on October 6th did they learn of the dramatic news Egypt and Syria had launched a surprise attack on Israel. At the negotiating table, while war raged in the Middle East, oil companies offered a 15% increase in the posted price of oil, about 45 cents more per barrel. For oil exporting countries, this was entirely insufficient. They demanded a 100% increase, an additional $3 per barrel. The chief negotiators for the oil companies were George Percy of Exxon and Andre Bernard of Shell. The oil companies found this price unacceptable. Who could agree to a 100% increase in oil prices? What would it do to the global economy? The companies contacted the governments of the world's largest economies, and the response was the same. The increase was too steep. The negotiations continued until October 12th. After midnight in the early hours of October 12th, 6 days after the war began, Percy and Bernard came to see Yamani in his suite at the Intercontinental Hotel. They explained that they could not make a new offer and requested 2 more weeks to prepare a response. Yamani said nothing. He ordered a Coke for Percy, cut a lime, and placed it in his drink. He waited. He wanted them to continue. He handed Percy the Coke, but neither Percy nor Bernard gave him anything in return. "You will not like this," Yamani finally spoke. He called Baghdad, spoke sharply in Arabic, and then told the 2 oil executives, "They are furious with you." The Yom Kippur War began on October 6, 1973, with a surprise attack by Egyptian and Syrian forces on Israeli positions along the Suez Canal and the Golan Heights. On October 8th, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan told Prime Minister Golda Meir that the Third Temple is falling. Following this, the Prime Minister wrote a secret letter to President Nixon, warning that Israel could be destroyed. On October 8th, the United States began sending military aid to Israel. After the initial shock, the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, mobilized and prepared a counterattack. On the night of October 15th, a division led by General Ariel Sharon crossed the Suez Canal, bringing Israeli forces onto the African continent. By October 20th, the Egyptian Third Army was cut off in the Sinai. 2 days later, on October 22nd, a ceasefire was declared. While the war was still ongoing, OPEC member states announced on October 16th at a meeting in Kuwait that they were raising the price of oil by 70% to $5.11 per barrel. However, this decision was not directly linked to the Yom Kippur War. OPEC countries had been preparing for this move for some time. By the end of 1973, the price of oil would reach nearly $12, a four-fold increase. That year, oil was no longer just an energy source. It had become a weapon. The first significant shift of energy into geopolitics occurred with oil. This transition actually happened in the early 20th century before World War I, when technology enabled the use of oil, specifically heavy fuel oil, for military purposes. Battleships, which were the primary symbols of global power at the time, became 2 to 3 knots faster. This was the key factor that introduced oil into geopolitics on a large scale. At that time, the British had been exploring the eastern part of the Ottoman Empire for some time. On the recommendation of Admiral John Arbuthnot Fisher, first Sea Lord, the United Kingdom acquired a majority stake in a then-small oil company that later became British Petroleum. Before World War I, the British began building battleships powered by fuel oil, while the Germans remained dependent on coal. Admiral John Arbuthnot Fisher, known as the Oil Maniac, was born in 1841 in Ceylon, then a British colony, now Sri Lanka. He joined the Royal Navy at the age of 13. As a cadet, he participated in the Crimean War and conflicts in China, and in 1874, he was promoted to captain. Fisher commanded several ships, and as the commander of the battleship HMS Inflexible, he took part in the bombardment of Alexandria. For 5 years, he headed the Admiralty's Ordnance and Torpedo Department, and in 1892, he became the third Sea Lord, responsible for overseeing the efficiency of the Royal Navy. In this role, Fisher initiated numerous reforms. He introduced submarines and destroyers into the Navy's arsenal, began using Lord Kelvin's improved compass, enhanced naval guns, and paved the way for the use of aircraft in the Navy. During the modernization of the Royal Navy, Fisher became a staunch advocate of oil as the fuel of the future. In 1902, Fisher leveraged his influence to prepare the first trial run of a warship powered by oil. However, this experiment ended in disaster. HMS Hannibal, which had initially departed from Portsmouth using coal, switched to oil but was immediately engulfed in thick black smoke due to a faulty engine. After this failure, Fisher traveled to a spa in Marienbad, now in the Czech Republic, where he met businessman William Knox Darcy, who was searching for oil in Persia. Darcy reinforced Fisher's belief that oil was the fuel of the future. When Fisher became First Sea Lord in 1904, he began transforming the Royal Navy so that new ships would be powered exclusively by oil. The last obstacle to achieving this goal disappeared in 1911 when Winston Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty. At that time, the British Navy had 74 submarines, which could only be powered by oil. While some oil was used to spray the coal and steam boilers across the fleet, the most crucial part of the fleet, battleships, still relied on coal. What the Navy and Churchill wanted was a new generation of battleships with larger guns, stronger armor, and greater speed. Naval warfare is a matter of common sense, Fisher reminded Churchill. The first necessity is speed, to fight when you want, where you want, and how you want. In convincing Churchill that oil was the future, Fisher was supported by Marcus Samuel, a businessman who had created the world's first tanker fleet. By merging this fleet with a Dutch oil company, he formed Royal Dutch Shell. The pair explained to Churchill that, unlike coal, oil did not degrade, was cheaper east of Suez and could reduce fuel costs by 78% and cargo space by 30% for merchant ships switching to oil. The final crucial argument was that battleships of the Royal Navy powered by coal could reach speeds of 21 knots, while those using oil could achieve 25 knots. For good reason, Marcus Samuel referred to Admiral Fisher as the godfather of oil. Daniel Yergin writes that the advantages of oil were most evident in wartime operations. Churchill later wrote, "While a ship used coal, an increasing number of sailors had to be pulled from the guns, if necessary, to shovel coal from distant bunkers, to bunkers closer to the furnaces or directly into the furnaces themselves, thus weakening the combat effectiveness of the ship at the most critical moment of battle. The use of oil allowed every type of ship to be built at a lower cost and size, while increasing firepower and speed. With the development of tanks and their involvement in ground battles, it became clear that oil had become a first-class strategic weapon." British Lord Curzon declared at the end of World War I, "The Allies floated to victory on a wave of oil." After World War I and throughout the 20th century, oil remained a crucial geopolitical weapon. The reason was simple. Unlike coal, steel, and metallurgy, oil production and exploitation did not require an advanced industrial base. Oil could be extracted in underdeveloped regions, transported to a port, loaded onto tankers, and delivered anywhere in the world. Because of its ease of transport, oil was the primary geopolitical tool throughout the 20th century, merging energy and geopolitics. Before oil, whale oil was used, obtained from the blubber of the sperm whale. Whalers hunted these massive whales, melted their blubber at sea, and thus produced oil used for lighting. In the first half of the 19th century, American whalers from New England alone hunted about 160,000 barrels of whale oil annually. At that time, the United States had as many as 700 whaling ships. However, as whales became scarce in the Atlantic Ocean, whalers had to sail farther, deep into the Pacific. Daniel Yergin writes that this was the golden age for whalers because oil prices were rising, but it was not golden for consumers. Prices reached $2.50 per gallon, and it seemed they would continue to rise. This encouraged the development of cheaper fuels, including camphene, a turpentine-based fuel that was effective but highly flammable. On August 27, 1859, Edwin Drake, a former railroad conductor with a falsely assumed rank of colonel, hired by George Bissell to drill for oil for the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company, discovered oil at a depth of 21 meters in Titusville, Pennsylvania. This marked the beginning of the oil age. The first major oil fields also defined the first geopolitical strategy surrounding this black gold. After Germany's failure to capture Moscow and defeat the Soviet Union in 1941, its entire strategy in the second year of the war was focused on securing oil resources. Entering North Africa meant, on one hand, saving the Italians and preventing their defeat by the British, while on the other hand, it was an attempt to conquer all of North Africa and advance into the Middle East, where large oil fields were located. German war strategy, including the Battle of Stalingrad, was largely driven by the need for oil. At the same time, Japan had been under an oil embargo for several years. As military operations in China intensified, the United States, under President Roosevelt, gradually imposed increasingly severe economic sanctions on Japan, eventually cutting off oil exports completely. This was a key motive in Japan's decision to plan an all-out military operation. One of the key moments in the history of oil occurred when the manager of the East Sumatra Tobacco Company, Jans Zijlker, visited a tobacco plantation in Sumatra, then part of the Dutch East Indies. This Dutch colonial empire had emerged from the lucrative spice trade. During his visit, Zijlker had to take shelter in a hut during a storm. Daniel Yergin describes what happened next. With him was a native overseer, Mander, who lit a torch. The bright flame caught Zylker's attention. He believed the flame was caused by the burning of unusually resinous wood. "How did you make that torch?" Zylker asked. Mander replied that he had soaked the torch in mineral wax. The local people had been collecting wax from the surface of small lakes for centuries, using it for various purposes, including sealing boats. The next morning, Zylker asked to be taken to one of these lakes. When he smelled it, he recognized that it was kerosene. He sent samples for analysis to Batavia, present-day Jakarta, and the results confirmed that the sample contained between 59 and 62% kerosene. Zylker's discovery marked the beginning of oil extraction in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. In 1890, he managed to obtain a concession from Dutch King Willem III, granting his company the rights to explore and extract oil under the name Royal Dutch. However, Zylker suddenly died in Singapore in the autumn of that same year, and Jean-Baptiste Auguste Kessler took over the company. In 1892, a 10-kilometer pipeline was built, connecting the wells to a refinery on the Balaban River. In April of that year, Royal Dutch produced its first barrels of kerosene under the brand name Crown Oil. The company became profitable only after 3 years, but then it started generating extraordinary revenues. When Royal Dutch merged with Shell, a company that transported oil tankers through the Suez Canal, it became one of the world's largest oil companies, a status it maintains today. On the eve of World War II, 4 regions produced the majority of the world's oil: the United States, the Soviet Union, the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, and the Middle East, where significant oil reserves had been discovered in the early 20th century. These oil fields determined the strategy of World War II. The goal was to capture resource-rich areas in Southeast Asia, primarily oil in Indonesia and rubber in Malaya, present-day Malaysia, then a British colony. To achieve this, Japan enlisted Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, one of its most educated military strategists. Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard University, developed the plan for the attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Japan's strategy focused on securing resources, primarily oil and rubber, and the preemptive attack on the U.S. fleet was part of that plan. World War II was marked by massive industrialization and large-scale weapons production. American industrial superiority was so great that they could produce thousands of Sherman tanks without significantly impacting production capacity. On the other hand, Germany produced only 1,650 highly valuable Tiger tanks in 1944 and 1945, making each loss significant. Thanks to vast material resources and almost unlimited oil supplies, the Allies won World War II. After dinner, my wife said, "Let's go to the workshop and try our luck once more." My heart was racing as I turned the lever. The engine started running. Put, put, put! And the music of the future echoed in a steady rhythm. For a full hour, we listened to the engine running, fascinated and tireless in our enjoyment of that unique sound. The longer it ran, the more sadness and anxiety disappeared from my heart. This is how Carl Benz described the moment when he and his wife Bertha first started the engine he had built in 1879. In 1876, Nicholas August Otto invented the internal combustion engine, in which the fuel mixture in the cylinder was ignited by an electric spark from a spark plug. What inscribed Benz into history was his design of a vehicle with an internal combustion engine. He mounted a 4-stroke engine on a 3-wheeled chassis with 2 high seats. Václav Smil, in his book Creating the 20th Century, writes that Benz was right when he spoke of the music of the future. In these ingenious machines, steel pistons are tightly compressed within cylinders, rapidly moving due to tiny explosions of compressed fuel. Their frantic up and down motion is transformed into smooth rotation, which is transmitted to wheels or propellers. Regardless of our relationship with these machines, their steady rhythm has become the tempo that dictates modern civilization. Installed in automobiles, they offer choice, personal freedom, and mobility. But at the same time, they contribute to environmental degradation and traffic congestion. They also drive global trade, powering trucks, ships, and airplanes, as well as many less visible machines indispensable in mining and construction. Rudolf Diesel patented a new type of engine that lacked a carburetor or spark plug, and could run on heavier fuel than the one powering Otto's engine and Benz's vehicle. Otto and diesel engines changed the world. The foundation of that world was oil. Oil played a crucial role in strategic and political terms, especially for the United States. It facilitated the relatively easy implementation of the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of Western Europe. The alliance with Saudi Arabia, cemented by the late President Roosevelt in a meeting with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud in the Red Sea 2 months before his death, ensured the supply of cheap oil to Western Europe. This cheap oil enabled rapid, painless, and inexpensive industrial reconstruction and development in Western Europe. In 1944, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin asked Soviet oil minister Nikolai Baibakov whether the Western powers, then Soviet allies, could break the Soviet Union if given the chance. Stalin posed this question because he had in mind Germany's assault on the Caucasus in 1942 and its attempt to seize the oil fields near Grozny and Baku. Stalin told Baibakov that if the Western powers cut off the Soviet Union's access to oil, the vast Soviet arsenal would become useless. Baibakov left the meeting fully aware that the Soviet Union needed and would continue to need vast amounts of oil. After World War II, an intensive search for new oil sources began in the Soviet Union, leading to the discovery of massive oil and gas fields in Siberia in the early 1960s. Although the Soviet Union was able to expand its influence in Africa and Asia, the Middle East was politically and economically out of reach, as the West fiercely defended its dominance in the region. The geopolitical role of energy became crucial in global strategic games. As declassified documents and memoirs reveal today, the carefully planned monopolistic power of OPEC had a significant impact on the global events. The Soviet Union, then the world's largest oil producer, found itself in a situation where 600 million tons of its oil became virtually worthless overnight, whether for developing its economy or maintaining its military system. This was one of the factors that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet economy and the socialist system. Václav Smil, in his book Energy and Civilization: A History, provides the following figures. Coal mining increased from 10 megatons in 1810 to 1 gigaton in 1910, reaching 1.53 gigatons by 1950 300-fold, from 10 megatons around 1880 to just over 3 gigatons by 1988. Besides civilian consumption, the energy consumption of military forces also increased enormously. The American M1 Abrams tank, powered by a gas turbine, consumes between 400 and 800 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers, depending on the terrain. This thirst for oil rapidly developed the industry of its extraction and refining. Francisco Parra, in his book Oil Politics: A Modern History, writes that in 1950, the United States was the only country with a developed oil industry. Between 1950 and 1973, the industry in the rest of the world grew ninefold, with an average annual growth rate of 10%. During this period, 200 new refineries were built, and many old ones were expanded. About 1,750 increasingly larger tankers were launched, and more than 2.5 billion vehicles appeared on the roads, more than half of them in the United States. Air travel replaced oceanic ships and became the dominant mode of long-distance travel. In Western Europe and Japan, oil replaced coal. The petrochemical industry introduced a wide range of entirely new products. Global oil demand more than quadrupled, rising from 11 million barrels per day in 1950 to 57 million barrels per day in 1970. Economies grew, and peace was largely maintained. The oil industry was dominated by 7 major companies. This was the golden age of oil. However, that world was powered by cheap oil. Between 1945 and 1973, oil prices barely changed, mostly remaining between $2 and $3 per barrel. A barrel is the standard unit in the oil industry, equivalent to 42 US gallons or about 159 liters. But in 1973, all of that would change. This process lasted about 50 years, beginning with the end of World War II and culminating in the well-known oil crises of the mid-1970s. This process had 2 parallel streams. On one hand, there were unlimited concessions to major oil companies, while on the other, producing countries gradually acquired knowledge about oil exploration, production, and economics. For example, the first Saudi oil minister, Zaki Yamani, was a Harvard graduate. As oil exporting countries and their managerial elites increasingly gained technical and economic knowledge, it became clear that the key was not profit sharing, but managing the costs of exploration and production. In 1959, the administration of President Dwight Eisenhower introduced oil import quotas, but this decision did not apply to all. Oil imports from Mexico and Canada were exempt from quotas, justified by the claim that transporting oil over land was safer than by sea. For Venezuela, which at the time accounted for 40% of U.S. oil imports, this decision was shocking. Venezuela's Minister of Mines and Hydrocarbons, Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, traveled to Washington to propose a fairer quota system, but his proposal was rejected. As a result, Pérez Alfonso began seeking new allies. In 1959, he found them in Cairo at the Arab Petroleum Congress. Less than a decade later, one decision would shake the world. From the early days of oil exploration to its pivotal role in global conflicts, including both world wars. It delves into how oil transformed naval and military strategies, reshaped alliances, and ultimately became a critical factor in global power struggles. By understanding the past, we can better comprehend the long-term consequences of energy dependency and its ongoing impact on international relations.